amongst the great classics of French literature, one story stands out: The Count of Monte Cristo. Written by Alexandre Dumas in the 19th century, the novel has been sold and adapted for movies and television around the world.
There's one book you'll find in every library, and that is The Count of Monte Cristo. It was an immediate success.
It's a very dark tale, an account of multiple horrifying crimes.
The story of Edmond Dantès, a young sailor betrayed and wrongly imprisoned for 14 years. He escapes to take his revenge under the alias the Count of Monte Cristo. But the novel's success was shrouded in controversy. Was Dumas the true author? Who or what was the real inspiration behind the story?
Dumas had always looked for inspiration from other people.
When Dumas was writing a book, he would carry out real research.
Dumas revealed his source, a police archive account of François Picaud, a 19th century cobbler, betrayed and wrongly imprisoned, who returns for bloody revenge. Events nearly identical to the Count of Monte Cristo. But is this story real? And did the killer who inspired Dumas actually exist?
It sounds a lot more like fiction.
With the world's greatest experts, we separate fiction from fact to uncover the truth.
This is certainly someone of whom there are traces throughout the archives.
Now, discover the secrets of the Count of Monte Cristo and the mystery behind the crime that inspired it. The Count of Monte Cristo is a masterpiece of French literature, written by Alexandre Dumas and published in 1844. It is without doubt one of the most popular novels in the world and has since been re-edited many dozens of times, as well as adapted 6 times for cinema and twice for television. At the time of its publication, Alexandre Dumas was already a famous writer, having recently published in a popular daily newspaper called Le Siècle, a novel which would also become legendary: The Three Musketeers. It was a few months later, in August 1844, that The Count of Monte Cristo was published in another daily newspaper, Le Journal de Débat. Originally, the novel was planned as a series, separated into 18 episodes and published once a week. From the very first episode, readers were hooked. It told the story of Edmond Dantès, a young sailor from Marseille who was betrayed by 3 friends, wrongly imprisoned at the Château d'If for 14 years, and who decides to take his revenge under the alias the Count of Monte Cristo.
Part of my work for radio is to visit people's libraries, and all these libraries I visit have one book in common that you'll find in every library anywhere, and that is The Count of Monte Cristo.
Monte Cristo.
From its success when it was first published to today, Monte Cristo maintains legendary status.
Let's summarize quickly. In 1815, a young sailor named Edmond Dantès returns home. He's good-looking, slightly naive, and on his return to Marseille, we learn that Edmond Dantès is to marry Mercedes, a young lady from Catalonia.
He has this perfect life, which goes with his character. Edmond Dantès is a nice guy who doesn't have a bad word to say about anyone. And 2 of his friends, Danglars and Fernando Mondego, decide to play what they call a joke on him. But this joke is purely a pretext behind which they can hide their jealousy and cruelty. They write a letter to the crown prosecutor informing him that on his latest voyage, Edmond Dantès conspired and met with deposed Emperor Napoleon. In 1815, that was an extremely bad idea. It was considered treason. And Edmond Dantès was completely unaware of their intentions because he only saw the good in people.
The day of the wedding, the police arrive and Dantès is taken to the fortress prison just outside Marseille, the Château d'If.
In prison, Dantès manages to dig a tunnel to another cell where he meets Abbé Faria, an Italian priest imprisoned for political crimes. The two become good friends, and while they're creating an escape plan, Faria suffers a stroke. But before he dies, he reveals to Edmond Dantès that he has hidden treasure on the island of Monte Cristo. Dantès uses this treasure to finance his revenge plan.
Faria dies, and because the prison guards plan to throw his body into the Mediterranean, Dantès wraps himself in Faria's shroud so that he is the one who's thrown into the sea instead.
When he gets out of the Chateau d'If, it's a sort of rebirth for him, because he becomes the Count of Monte Cristo and takes revenge on every person who did him wrong. One by one and gradually, the reader becomes disgusted, as does he, by all this violence, this cruelty and wickedness. He has become a bad person, after all.
So it's a very dark tale, and you can read the story of Monte Cristo as an account of several horrifying crimes.
The serialized novel of Monte Cristo was a huge success. But as newspaper sales and Alexandre Dumas' popularity reached their peak, there were doubts, and the public began to ask questions as to the origins of the story. Were the story's characters based on real people? How could Dumas have invented such a macabre plot? At the time, Dumas was already known as a writer who freely took inspiration from existing writing, events he'd heard about, as well as places he already knew.
Dumas was a historian. He wrote many books purely as a historian, and all his fiction is based on history.
When Dumas wrote a novel, he would carry out a real investigation. He would go to the locations. He would read everything there was to know. He didn't choose the Chateau d'If as one of the main locations in his novel by chance. He knew the Chateau d'If through his political engagement, because in the 19th century, there were regular debates on how to improve living conditions in prison. He also knew about the Chateau d'If via a more personal link. During his childhood, his family told him the story of the fate of General Kléber, a friend of his father's, who was imprisoned at the Chateau d'If for 18 years.
But after the novel's success, rumors began to circulate, and this created controversy. What if Alexandre Dumas wasn't the real author of The Count of Monte Cristo?
Dumas was accused because, well, it was a sort of jealousy of Dumas' success. He was very well known and very successful. He worked in conjunction with collaborators who would find ideas, plan the novel, and sometimes even help him write it. So yes, Dumas had collaborators, but Dumas had always looked for inspiration from other people. He was always on the lookout and paid close attention to any interesting information he might come across. The Three Musketeers was inspired directly by a book called The Memoirs of M. d'Artagnan. It's a very bad novel from which Dumas created something of incredible, epic, legendary proportions.
In answer to those who accused him of plagiarism, Alexandre Dumas had to respond publicly. In 1857, he published an annex text as an addition to the novel, which explained what his publishers, Bethune and Plon, had asked of him, as well as the context of the writing phase of the novel. And most importantly, he revealed his source of inspiration.
My objective was to uncover a story of intrigue for Misters Bethune and Plon. Sometime before the request, I'd marked a page in Pouchet's The Police Uncovered, where there was a 20-page anecdote entitled The Diamond and the Vengeance. In its original format, the story was idiotic, but that doesn't mean that within the story there wasn't a real pearl of a tale to be told. People are welcome to search for sources of the Count of Monte Cristo, other than the one that I cite here, but I'd be astonished if they can find one.
Through this annex text, Dumas revealed that the idea for his novel stemmed from a discovery he made in the police archives, meaning the story of Edmond Dantès was inspired by real facts that were listed under the title The Diamond and the Vengeance by someone named Jacques Pouchet, an archivist of the police born in 1758. Bruno Fellini is a historian and expert on the Paris police. He's the author of several works on crimes committed in the 19th century. And he has investigated this strange story that inspired Alexandre Dumas, in addition to its author, Jacques Pouchet.
Jacques Pouchet was born in Paris to an educated bourgeois family. He was part of that generation who had front-row seats in Paris during the French Revolution. Jacques Pouchet was not a novelist. The books he wrote are about political economy, statistics, administration, the police. They're not fiction or for entertainment. Pouchet is an interesting person who had contentious connections with the revolution. At one point, he was almost guillotined. He got the job of archive custodian at the Paris police headquarters. It wasn't a particularly impressive position to be archive custodian at the police headquarters. It was actually quite a modest title. He was an administrative worker. He filed and categorized, but perhaps it was because he had access to these documents that he started to write his own accounts. It's important to remember that during the reign of Louis XIV, Paris was the biggest city in the world. Lots of things happened. The police could write it down, and of course, Pouchet finds all these police reports very interesting, and he has this idea to publish something later on, when circumstances will allow, when he's retired and he's no longer in charge of the archives.
For several decades, Jacques Pouchet kept notes on every police matter that passed through his office. In his spare time, he transformed each report into a short story, each a few pages long, which summarized the facts, the victims, the guilty parties, the investigation, and its outcome. In 1838, his work was published in 6 volumes under the title Memoirs from the Archives of the Police Force of Paris, from the reign of Louis XIV to present day. And it was in Volume 5 that The Diamond and the Vengeance, which related some extremely violent events, could be found. Jacques Pouchet warns his reader in a foreword that the case he's about to relate is unlike any of the others. From within these hidden archives, I have extracted the following tale, which I suggest to my readers is one of the most unusual they will read in this collection of memoirs. What was it that these few pages contained that so captured the attention of the famous Alexandre Dumas?
When you read this text of about 20 pages, it's not particularly well written. The pace is too quick, the plot development is clumsy. But so what? You think it's a true story, so it's interesting. That's what piques Dumas' curiosity.
The events described by Pouchet took place in 1807 in Paris, in the neighborhood of Sainte-Opportune, near Les Halles, where a group of friends from Nîmes would regularly meet at a café. The case includes several protagonists: Mathieu Le Pion, the café owner, and 4 of his regulars: Guillaume Solari, Gervais Chaubard, Antoine Allut, and a certain François Picaud.
Picaud was a cobbler from Nîmes who lived in Paris, so he's a worker. He's a young man of good reputation, but also a bit of a braggart. He meets up with his friends from Nîmes at a café owned by Mathieu Le Pion, and that day he was especially happy. He announces that he's getting married to Marguerite de Vigouroux, who was quite a wealthy young woman with a dowry of 100,000 francs, so he had 2 reasons to be very happy. First, Marguerite is very pretty, and second, she comes with a large dowry, so he brags a little at the café and invites his friends to the wedding, of course. Mathieu Le Pion is there behind the counter, and his friends Gervais Chaubard, Guillaume Solari, and Antoine Allut from Nîmes are there too. And then Picaud leaves. When he leaves, Le Pion says to his 3 friends, "Let's play a joke on him."
Under the guise of a joke, he talks to the others who are left at the bar, and he decides to accuse Picaud of being a royalist spy working for the English government.
According to Pouchet's tale, Allut refuses to be part of the joke and leaves the café. But Chaubard and Solari accept their roles in Le Pion's game.
Le Pion is jealous because he's a little bit in love with Marguerite, but his idea is just to shut down Picaud's bragging. He puts his plan into action and accuses Picaud of spying for the English. Why that's funny, I don't know, but that's his plan.
Mathieu Lupion takes advantage of the arrival of a policeman, a regular at the café, to make his accusation.
At the time, in 1807, under Napoleonic rule, people were very paranoid. Conspiracy was rife. The authorities were on their lookout for traitors. And so to accuse someone, anonymously or not, of spying for the English was very serious, and things could get out of hand very quickly.
On hearing the accusations made by Lupion, the police commissioner immediately sent his report to the Duke of Rovigo, minister for the police under Napoleon Bonaparte.
When the minister of the police received the report, he didn't waste any time and arrested Picaud in secret and disappeared him. There was no court case, no particular proceedings of any kind. Picaud was put in prison until the fall of Napoleon.
Picaud was sent to the Fenestrelle fortress in the Piedmont region, which at the time was part of France, and so he was imprisoned and hidden away.
The parallels between the events described by Jacques Pouchet in his memoirs on the police archives and the story written by Alexandre Dumas are evident. Under the guise of a joke, François Picaud was betrayed by his friends Lupion, Chobard, and Solari just before he was to wed Marguerite. Edmond Dantès was also betrayed by his friends, Danglars and Fernand Mondego, just as he was to marry the beautiful Mercedes. Picaud was accused of spying for the English and imprisoned at the Fenestrelle fortress. Dantès was accused of supporting Bonaparte and was imprisoned at the Château d'If. But the similarities don't end there.
When you read Pouchet's account and the Count of Monte Cristo, it's easy to see the events that are very similar.
Picaud was in prison for 7 years. Whilst he was there, he met a member of the clergy from Milan, who was a very rich man who made him his heir and treated Picaud as his son. He then died and left Picaud his fortune.
Time passed, and by 1814, when the imperial government collapsed, and around the 15th of April, a man stooped by his suffering and aged by his sense of desperation, more so than by time itself, came out of the Fenestrelle fortress. For him, 7 years may as well have been half a century.
Picaud was liberated at the end of Napoleon's reign with the restoration of the monarchy. He goes back to Paris and changes his identity. His name is now Joseph Louchet, and Joseph Louchet arrives in Paris and decides to take his revenge.
Dumas' inspiration is undeniable. Just like Picaud, Dantès becomes friends with a rich Italian priest. When they leave prison, both Picaud and Dantès assume new identities. Motivated by rage and a desire for vengeance, they both do everything in their power to find those who had betrayed them. Using the name Joseph Louchet and having inherited an immense fortune, Picaud returns to the Saint-Opportun neighborhood. He learns that Antoine Alou has left Paris to go back to Nîmes. Antoine Alou, the only one who refused to be a part of the joke, which destroyed his life. Picaud makes his way to Nîmes and changes his identity again to become the Abbé Baldini, an Italian priest. He then finds Antoine Alou and pretends to be searching for information on his deceased friend, François Picaud.
He explains that he knew François Picaud, had been his confessor, and that Picaud had become very rich and had entrusted him with a diamond worth 50,000 francs. He gives Alou the diamond, in exchange for which he asks Alou to explain to him what happened and why Picaud had been arrested. Because, he tells him, Picaud wished to know the names of those who were guilty of his imprisonment so that those names could be engraved on his tombstone.
In exchange for the diamond, Antoine Alou agrees to reveal the guilty parties: Gervais Chobard, Guillaume Solari, and of course, Mathieu Lupion. Picaud then returns to Paris to confront the three men. What he discovers when he gets there only serves to increase his rage. During the 7 years he's been absent, his fiancée, Marguerite de Vigoureux, has married Mathieu Lepion.
The young woman with a generous dowry who was supposed to marry Picaud was all alone after Picaud's disappearance. And so Lupien made Picaud's fiancée his wife and spent her dowry. And instead of the little café next to the Place Saint-Opportune, he now has a large café which looked onto the grand boulevards of Paris, next to the Boulevard des Italiens, the most fashionable restaurant area in Paris.
Picaud designs a Machiavellian plan with just one aim: infiltrate the life of Mathieu Lepion and take his revenge. The account by Jacques Pouchet, based on police archives, gives the details of what happened next. François Picaud now goes by the name of Prosper and manages to get a job as a server at Lupion's new café. There he finds Guilhem Solari and Gervais Chobard, who are still friends with the owner, as well as his ex-fiancée, Marguerite Lupion.
Obviously, Picaud is unrecognizable. He's been in a dungeon for 7 years, and that changes a man. He's stooped, and he's aged 20 years and 7. No one recognizes him.
Picaud's first target is Gervais Chobard, who disappears overnight.
His body is discovered on a bridge over the Seine with stab wounds. A dagger is still sticking out of the body with a number 1 written on the handle. Very mysterious.
The Paris police investigate this strange murder, but according to Jacques Pouchet's account, no clues were found at the scene of the crime. The police do everything they can, but the criminal evades all forms of investigation. After Gervais Chobard, Guilhem Solari is next to suffer the vengeance of François Picaud. And this time, he uses a different method: poison. One night, Solari is overcome with horrific pain and dies whilst experiencing the most terrible convulsions.
And on his coffin was inscribed the number 2. Next, he deals with the main guilty party, Mathieu Lepion. But this time, he takes his time in a much more subtle approach.
Patiently, day by day, Picaud works to destroy the life Mathieu Lepion has made for himself.
He engineers a whole series of ruses to bring about Lupin's financial and also moral ruin.
He creates various traps for him. In particular, he sends an ex-convict to charm and seduce Lupien's daughter by making her believe he's a prince, an important aristocrat. Lupien gives permission for his daughter to marry this prestigious man. This man even gets Lupien's daughter pregnant.
And so there's a banquet. This is revenge of the deepest kind because it's a repeat of the original wedding banquet theme.
And on the night of the wedding, a message makes its way around to the guests at the table of honor, revealing the groom to be an ex-convict.
And because Lupin's daughter is pregnant as well, the Lupin family suddenly loses all honor and credibility.
And obviously, indirectly, Lupien is also dishonored.
Very methodically, Picaud poisons Mathieu Lupion's dog, then Marguerite's parrot. He has their son, Eugène, framed for a burglary he didn't commit, and Eugène is condemned to 20 years in prison. Next, a devastating fire destroys the café overlooking the Grand Boulevards.
And so Lupien is ruined, dishonored, left with nothing. Paradoxically, his only remaining friend is Prosper, whom he still doesn't recognize as Picaud. And Prosper, or Picaud, offers to save Lupien from this situation. First by marrying his daughter, and then by helping him financially to get the café back on its feet.
By the end, the Lupin family's ruin is so bad that Lupin's daughter prostitutes herself in order to get a little extra money from Prosper, the server of the café, who is actually Picaud in disguise.
So Picaud wins, and there's just one thing left to do: kill Lupien. Number 3.
It's nighttime, and Lupin wanders through the Tuileries garden when Picaud decides to conclude his quest for revenge. He approaches Lupin, threatening to stab him, and tells him the truth about the death of Chaubard, Solari, and the succession of events that had led to his dishonor and the total destruction of his family.
This is his final act of vengeance. Lupin learns that Picaud is the source of every bad thing to have happened to him. He finally understands that this server is none other than Picaud, aged and free from prison, and who has literally destroyed everything Lupin tried to build with the money that wasn't his to take from the dowry he received instead of Picaud, who was sent to the dungeons.
Three murders and a tale of vengeance which inspired Alexandre Dumas. Like Picaud, the Count of Monte Cristo puts a terrible plan into action to ruin the reputation of those who betrayed him. But can we be sure the facts recorded in Jacques Pouchot's memoirs are true? When the text is read, it is evident that certain facts have been invented by the author, who went as far as to include fictional conversations. Could Pouchet have invented the entire story?
For his memoirs to be read by a maximum number of people, perhaps he embellished the story to make the story of vengeance more of a page-turner.
It could have been a minor news item that took up a few columns in the newspaper with the real facts. But the dialogue is the start of something that could resemble a novel. So there are some small fictional elements within the text which makes it less realistic. There are certain things we're not told about. It's full of holes, a text full of holes, where the reader has to fill in the gaps themselves.
In order to separate fact from fiction, we investigated to find any existing evidence that could prove the bloody tale found in the police archives of Jacques Pouchet to be true. Our initial research all points to the same conclusion. The character of Monte Cristo was inspired by François Picaud, a cobbler from Nîmes in the 19th who really existed. The locations mentioned in Pouchet's story are certainly real.
This is Place Sainte-Opportune, where we're told Lupin had his café. Obviously, Place Sainte-Opportune at the time looked nothing like this. No shops, no newsstands. But perhaps one of these cafes used to belong to Lupin. Obviously, this area is very different to what it was, and there were no tourists, of course. My guess is that it was a much less respectable area, and a cafe didn't really have the same function. There wasn't so much foot traffic, it was more of a local canteen where people from the same community would gather, people from the neighborhood. And if none of this had happened, if Picaud hadn't been falsely accused and taken to Fenestrelle, he would have married Marguerite Bigarreau here at Saint-Paul et Saint-Louis Church, also known simply as Saint-Louis Church, in the heart of Marais district.
Fenestrelle Fortress, where Picaud is said to have been imprisoned, also exists. And it is in this prison for political prisoners near Turin, which was part of France at the start of the 19th century, that those who plotted against Napoleon were held. The locations may certainly exist, but the details of the case are harder to verify. In his foreword, Pouchet explains he based his text on official notes, interrogation reports, criminal charges, and defense pleas. But one problematic issue is that most of the police archives at the Paris headquarters were destroyed in a fire on the 24th of May, 1871. The date corresponds with the timing of what's known as the Paris Commune, a violent insurrection mounted by the people of Paris against the government, during which the French capital was set ablaze. To find out the truth behind the story of François Picaud, we must go back to the original 6-volume publication of Pouchot's memoirs from the police archives.
I became interested in Jacques Pouchet because I'm interested in legal archives, and so I bought his memoirs based on the archives of the police headquarters. It summarizes the police history from Louis XIV's reign, and it contains all sorts of anecdotes, stories, and criminal cases of prostitution and blackmail. While reading it, I realized that there were a lot of question marks surrounding this book and Jacques Pouchet. Firstly, the book published in 1838 came out 8 years after his death.
Jacques Pouchet, police archivist, died on September 28, 1830. His life's work, published in 6 volumes, was therefore published posthumously. Another edition actually indicates a co-author. His name? Étienne Léon Lamotte Langon, indicating that Jacques Pouchet may have died before finishing his book.
His widow needed money, and so she tried to sell what her husband left her. And since Pouchet had no fortune to speak of, she no doubt sold books and objects that belonged to him, as well as something very precious, his archives. A publisher was interested, so she sold them and undoubtedly made a little money through his transaction. At the time, there were no real moral rights for authors, and the publisher gave the archives to another writer who added more stories, which he made up.
At the time, writers and publishers regularly used other authors to write books in their name. These people would add a little color and excitement to a text that was otherwise considered too boring. And if Étienne Léon Lamotte Langon altered Jacques Pouchet's text, this casts serious doubt on the truthfulness of the events described in The Diamond and the Vengeance.
If you read it carefully, you notice that the text fluctuates, and that each chapter isn't necessarily written in the same style. There are some very serious sections which we can assume are Pouchet's original text. But there are also more anecdotal sections, even certain slightly crazy notions, which feel fictional, and this is no doubt the work of the person who revised Pouchet's text.
In the 6 volumes of Pouchet's memoirs, it is almost impossible to identify the elements that have come directly from his original manuscript and those added by a separate writer chosen by the publisher, Étienne Léon Lamotte Langon. Another troubling fact is that the references of this 19th century writer do not match the serious background of Jacques Pouchet in any way.
Lamotte Langon was someone who was specialized at mixing the real with the imaginary. He would start with something true, but he would create a fiction from that without presenting his work as a novel, which is the nuance here. They are texts that are written very quickly to make some money. It's not well written, the text has not been worked at or really thought about.
He was someone who had an important position during the empire. He was a state representative, an advisor, a baron. He lost all that when Napoleon was deposed. And you can tell he published things very quickly because if you read his text carefully, you see he didn't have time to proofread them and their inconsistencies. Lamotte Langdon had published the false memoirs of a police lieutenant general, and Lamotte Langdon had also published texts that we consider today to be the crime genre's predecessor. He even published a false novel under the name of Anne Radcliffe. Instead of publishing a Gothic novel under his own name, which wouldn't have sold well, he used the name Anne Radcliffe, a successful author, to publish a novel that he had in fact written himself. And today, many people still think that Anne Radcliffe wrote that book, but in fact it was written in French from start to finish by Lamotte Langdon.
Could The Revenge of François Picaud have been written by Étienne Léon Lamotte Langon and not Jacques Pouchet? The answer to that question can be found in the inconsistencies discovered in the 20-page account, which reveals an author who was much less serious-minded than the Jacques Pouchet we know as a meticulous archivist.
There are at least 3 mistakes that I doubt Pouchet would have committed. In 1807, a laborer cobbler by the name of François Picaud had a room in Paris. But when you turn the page, Picaud becomes Pierre Picaud. It's very curious for a text that is intended for scholarly use to have a character whose first name changes, especially since it happens again with his fiancée's name. To begin with, her name is Marguerite, but later on it becomes Thérèse. It could be a careless mistake, but normally when you publish a book, it is proofread in the correction stage, and this sort of inconsistency would have been identified and removed. Importantly, a little further on, there is another inconsistency, which is more or less impossible for Pochette to have made. What happens is François Picaud is going to marry into the rich family of Marguerite or Thérèse. We're not too sure, when a jealous cafe owner by the name of Lupin denounces him as the Minister for Police, the Duke of Rovigo. But in 1807, the Duke of Rovigo was not yet the Minister for Police. He only has that title from 1810. Pochette knew that, so it's an error that Pochette would never have committed, whereas Lamothe Langon, who has much less knowledge of the administrative organization of the police force, is much more likely to commit such an error. So it's an indication that a great deal of this text was written by Lamothe Langon.
3 mistakes in the text, and there is more room for doubt thanks to another inconsistency in the details of the murder of traitor number 1, Gervais Chobard, committed by François Picaud in the middle of Paris over the River Seine.
Put ourselves in Picot's shoes. How would you stab someone here? This is the center of Paris. We're on the River Seine. It's an area that's well frequented. You'd be highly visible, especially because at the time there was a toll booth. You had to pay 10 centimes at one end of the bridge, and there was another toll booth at the other end of the bridge. So you'd have to be quick and capable of certain emotional attachment in order to walk to the other end of the bridge like any other person out for a walk and manage to get away before anyone else noticed the lifeless body on the ground. And what's also surprising is that this murder didn't have a greater impact. I've never heard of it, apart from Pouchot's text. One might imagine that in such a well-known part of town, the press at the time might have talked more about a murder, especially given the dramatic nature of the dagger left in the body with the number 1 on the handle. It sounds a lot more like fiction, a fictional series, than a crime that might have taken place in Paris at the time.
The second part of The Diamond and the Vengeance feels much more Shakespearean. Having killed Mathieu Le Pion in the Tuileries Gardens, François Picaud is mysteriously captured.
Antoine Allu finds Picaud and captures him, explaining that Picaud has destroyed his life too, because of the diamond. And so he decides to take his revenge on Picaud.
According to events in the text, Antoine Allu's life took a turn for the worse after meeting Picaud in Nîmes. His financial situation was desperate, and so he sold the diamond Picaud had used to bargain with him and learned too late that he only received half its real value. Furious, Allu murdered the jeweler and began to search for Picaud. Having captured him, Antoine Allu goes mad and kills François Picaud in a fit of rage. The story ends in 1828. Antoine Allu is on his deathbed somewhere in London. He decides to confess to a priest whose name in the text is given as Abbé P. He tells him the story in all its detail. And it is this priest who is said to have anonymously sent the details of Antoine Allu's confession to the police in Paris, along with a letter which is transcribed in its entirety at the end of the account.
Allu was filled with remorse for giving Picaud the names of his friends and then killing Picaud himself, confessed to a priest who then betrayed that confession, thanks to which the police finally worked out what had happened to Lupin, the truth behind the murders, the fire. It feels very much like fiction. It's too crazy to be real. But because it's mixed up with some very serious accounts from the Paris police archives, we tend to think of it as a valid account in the criminal annals of Paris.
There's no reason to think that these people, Allu, Solari, etc., Lupien, Picaud, didn't exist.
The problem is we have no archival documents, and we have no other prior accounts which tell the same story, so it's very difficult to prove anything. The characters in The Diamond and the Vengeance are not important people socially. They are not well known, so it's very difficult to find traces of them to make sure they really existed.
There are certain clues in the text of The Diamond and the Vengeance which can guide our research. We know it happened around the area of Place Sainte-Opportune. We have names, Solari, Lupien, Allu. We know they came from Nîmes. We know the date of the wedding, the date of the arrest, and we know which prison Picaud was sent to.
To find traces of him today, you really have to start from scratch. You need a genealogist to look into the history. You need to go to Nîmes and go to every city François Picaud went to in order to find any descendants to bring the details of the story as close to reality as we can. It's the only way.
Alexandre Dumas was inspired by facts he believed to be true. But whole sections of the account are thrown into doubt today, leaving us with one final question that needs to be answered. Is any part of this text true? Or is every detail entirely invented? To move forward in our investigation, we first tried to find evidence of the imprisonment of a man named François Picaud at the Fenestrelle fortress in the Piedmont area of Italy between 1807 and 1814.
The difficulty of finding proof of existence of these prisoners is that one expects there to be lists of names. But unfortunately, given that this was at a time of revolution, legal proceedings take place in extraordinary circumstances, very often in other cities and extremely rapidly. So lists of prisoners were not necessarily kept and archived. Very often, it's the buildings themselves that can give us the answer. Historical graffiti gives us information and names of the prisoners because they all sign the walls. If François Picaud really existed and was really imprisoned on Fenestrelle Fortress, I think we could find a written trace of him somewhere on the walls of the fortress.
But having made contact with the Italian authorities who manage the Fenestrelle fortress today, an official letter confirms that there is no recorded mention of a French prisoner at the Fenestrelle fortress during the Napoleonic reign, and no trace of anyone by the name of François Picaud has been found on the prison walls. No trace of a gravestone in the name of François Picaud after his murder in Paris either. And so, the investigation continues in the south of France, where François Picaud was supposedly born, in the city of Nîmes. Stéphane Cosson, a genealogy expert, searched the regional archives to try and discover the truth. With the help of his students, Cosson searched for proof of the existence of the characters mentioned in The Diamond and the Vengeance. Birth, death, and marriage registers, police reports, criminal charges, lists of prisoners. The researchers pored over thousands of archives with a fine-tooth comb in search of François Picaud, Mathieu Lupien, Guillaume Solari, Gervais Chaubard, Antoine Allu, or Marguerite de Vigoreau.
We discovered that the Allu family were from two villages close to Nîmes, Dufort and Saint-Martin de Sosanac. The surname Allu has existed in the Gare area since the 17th century and is still around today.
The research revealed that other important names in the story also exist within the region. Allupion was found in Calvisson, a small village near Nîmes. A marriage certificate dated from 1805 shows a certain Marguerite Vigoreau. But there is no link between these two people, and more importantly, neither of them was ever implicated in a murder. As for François Picaud, the main character in the story, it seems he simply never existed.
They looked for Picaud in all the different parishes of Nîmes. Looking at the civil registers, they didn't find anything. Nothing.
But one final name gave Stéphane Cosson and his students an interesting lead. That of Guillaume Solari, the man who supposedly died as a result of poisoning by François Picaud.
It was when we were searching for Guillaume Solari that we found somebody else who did exist, and that we had proof of.
A letter dated May 8, 1826, written by the state representative of the Rhône region, allows the investigation to probe further. In it, the police in Lyon report their arrest of a dangerous individual who had already been sentenced to hard labor and who had escaped multiple times using several identities: Pastorel, Deville, Lafayette, and Scolari. Continuing their investigation into this mysterious individual, Stéphane Cosson and his students found reports and criminal charges detailing the man's activities, his crimes, and his various aliases. And within the Rhône archives, they discovered his birth record, which would reveal his true identity. Gaspard Antoine Pastorel, born October 9, 1784 in Marseille. This name led them to one final document from an army registry. Enrolled in 1806, Pastorel was arrested for attempting to evade military service. He was condemned to 3 years in prison in the Piedmont region, near Turin, the same area that François Picaud is said to have been imprisoned.
A prison close to Turin. It could be Fenestrelle. So is this the man who inspired Picaud? Whatever the case, this is someone who really existed, and of whom we have proof throughout the archives. Perhaps this is the real Picaud.
It's impossible to know how Étienne Léon Lamotte-Langon, author of fake documents, who discovered the police archives belonging to the widow of Jacques Pouchet, and without doubt the secret author of The Diamond and the Vengeance, could have learned of the existence of Gaspard Antoine Pastorel. And yet, there are troubling links between the letter from the Rhône state representative and The Diamond and the Vengeance. The characters are all originally from Nîmes, the city where Pastorel was sentenced. Like him, our hero Picaud constantly changes identities. He's a cobbler, just like one of Pastorel's victims mentioned in the state representative's letter. This letter also references a jeweler, an element Lamotte-Langon decided to add to his completely fabricated tale.
Now that we've done the research, we can conclude that there is a real, if extraordinary, story which inspired the first novel, The Diamond and the Vengeance, which in turn inspired a second novel, The Count of Monte Cristo. The author of The Diamond and the Vengeance created a sort of patchwork. He took a fact like the existence of the Duke of Rovigo, but he changed the dates. He didn't care. He never thought anyone would check, because to him it wasn't important. Then he took the elements of Pastorel's life, but used a different name to avoid making problems for himself, since Pastorel was a real person and could be recognized. So he called him Picaud instead. There were Picauds in the area too, but that didn't matter.
The story of revenge told in the memoirs drawn from the police archives and which inspired the famous Alexandre Dumas is therefore not a true story. François Picaud was invented by an author better known for his talent for falsification rather than his writing skills, and who himself was most likely inspired by a real criminal from Marseille, Gaspard Antoine Pastorel. A man that everyone had forgotten, until a genealogist and his students found proof of his existence nearly 2 centuries later.
So, is Picaud Pastorel or Pastorel Picaud? Either way, one inspired the other. That much seems obvious to me.
We are in a fictional paradox, meaning nothing is real, but everything is true. What is so attractive about Picot's story is that it's somewhere between fiction and reality, and it's that doubt which has created the legend. That's what appealed to Dumas, and through Dumas, it's what appealed to the readers of the Count of Monte Cristo too.
What's real is Monte Cristo, Edmond Dantès, Alexandre Dumas' novel. It inspires people and has gained legendary status. That's much more real than either the real or imaginary story of François Picaud.
More than 150 years since the original publication of Alexandre Dumas' novel, this investigation has shined a light on some of the true origins of the Count of Monte Cristo. But the extraordinary fate of this story comes down to Alexandre Dumas and his talent alone. His work has survived the passage of time and remains still one of the world's most widely read books ever.